late autumn, a little bit cool as you'd expect it. Today I want to talk about the joys of privatisation, the ins and outs, and a little bit of humour. That's right, there's even humour in privatisation. Now, as you know, over the last 4 to 5 decades, a tsunami of privatisation and globalisation and corporatisation and deregulation has swept the world, including Australia. Today I want to concentrate on the effects of widespread privatisation in Australian society. Now, the first thing is that this has got nothing to do with economics and everything to do with ideology. Privatisation is an ideology that has had profound implications on people around the world. Growing inequality in societies is directly linked to the degree of privatisation which occurs in a community. Let's look at the history of state-owned assets in a capitalist society. Because I'm not talking about, a communist society or even a socialist society. I'm talking about a capitalist society and the role that state-owned enterprises have in the economic mix. Historically, the significant aspects of the state taking on the responsibility of providing essential and necessary services and infrastructure to the population they represent was linked to both world wars, World War I and World War II. Let's not forget that millions of people, especially in World War I, died fighting for the glory of God, King and country. Nothing to do with freedom or democracy or economic equality. And the fact is that after World War I, and even before in Australia, people demanded that the state provide essential services. This philosophical basis was not based on the fact that the state had changed its colours, because obviously the ultimate role of the state is to maintain the authority of those who exercise that authority. But revolts and revolutions and parliamentary reforms have forced the state to take on the responsibility of looking after the basic needs of society, and that's where these state-owned enterprises were created. Now, concentrating on Australia, the first state-owned enterprise was the establishment of a Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, because with the growth of vaccination and the benefits it provided to wholesale members of the community, large members of the community, and the fact the private sector in Australia was not actually able to meet that demand, the first Labor government created the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories before World War I. We also saw the creation of the Commonwealth Bank, which was currently called the People's Bank. And the Commonwealth Bank was again established prior to World War I as a result of people needing finance to either buy a home or start a business. And private banks, which had a history of going bankrupt, were not in the position of providing small loans to people. So this is another reason, this is the main reason the Commonwealth Bank was established, to allow ordinary Australians to actually have access to finance without being concerned about a particular bank going bankrupt in terms of their deposits, because before that there was a history of small banks going bankrupt in this country. Now, post-World War II, the push to establish state-owned assets in Australia gained momentum. It gained momentum for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons was a strong trade union movement which demanded that its members and other people in society had access to basic necessities. And we saw the extraordinary growth of public housing post-World War II, when men and women who'd fought in the wars wanted something in return for their sacrifices and the sacrifices of those that had never come back, and the responsibility the state had to the descendants of those who had fought and died, who were seriously injured in war. So we saw the extension of the public housing sector, extraordinary extension of the public housing sector. We saw the establishment of state-owned enterprises to provide basic necessities, like Telecom, Qantas, which became a state-owned asset. We saw the growth of the Commonwealth Bank because it provided a government guarantee to depositors, because it was owned by the Commonwealth Government. We saw the rise of Qantas as an essential service because of the fact that this country is a continent in the southern hemisphere, far, far away from its colonial roots, which are European roots, and people wanted to return, see family and friends. We saw the telecommunications. Being a large continent, an extensive continent, telecommunications were an essential services, and again, they were provided by the state. And when I mean they're provided by the state, it was the blood, sweat and tears of generations of Australians whose taxes were then used to provide these essential services, whether it was access to gas, access to electricity, access to the health services, access to finances, and the list goes on and on. In the late 1970s, we saw the emergence of a new ideology in the West. And that ideology was based on the principle the state should return to its original roots, which is a method of control, a method of maintaining those who exercise power to continue to exercise power. The private sector could and should provide basic services to the population as a whole on a user pay system, and that's the key, a user pay system. The difference between a national owned asset and a user pay system is that in many cases people who can't access a user pay system because of their marginal financial situation have access to the basic necessities. So what we saw was an orgy of privatisation. We saw the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank, which was initiated by the Hawke-Keating Labor government. We saw the privatisation of the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, which was initiated and carried out by the Keating government. We saw the privatisation of Telecom, which was carried out by both Liberal and Labor governments. We saw the privatisation of Medibank Private by the Abbott-led Liberal National Party government. We saw the privatisation during the Howard era of aged care facilities. We've seen the privatisation of early childhood development facilities. Obviously, we saw the privatisation of many other assets which are held in public hands, like gas and electricity. So these privatisation could be carried out by governments which at the federal level had been elected for 3 years and at the state level in many cases for 4 years. They had the ability to privatise assets which had taken generations to grow to provide basic services to the population at large, because state-owned assets in Australia do not belong to the people. State-owned assets belong to the government of the day. And if you have an ideological inclined government, well then you privatise public assets. And this orgy of privatisation include the country's airports, the country's ports, gas and electricity, telecommunications, early childhood development, Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, the Commonwealth Bank, and I could go on and on and on. We've seen at the state level the privatisation of the Titles Office, the privatisation of the Road Traffic Authority, and the list goes on and on. So governments at any particular point in time can sell a public asset if they have a majority in both houses of Parliament. So the central weakness of national or state-owned assets was based on the fact that its ownership belonged to the government of the day, not the people. And we'll talk about that weakness later on. Now, privatisation took many, many ridiculous terms. And it was basically a fire sale. What we mean by a fire sale is that at the end of the fire, there's bits and pieces left over and people get a bargain. And this is what happened with the majority of publicly owned assets which were sold on the open market. One of the most ridiculous examples is the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories. And when the COVID pandemic hit our shores a few years ago, well, we had to scramble to try to get vaccinations from overseas in an era when everybody wanted vaccinations. So we've got that particular situation. So the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, this is where it's a little bit humorous, as I said, fire sales. The Commonwealth Serum Laboratories shares were sold for around $2.50 each. Today they're worth almost $300 each. Commonwealth Bank shares were sold for around $5.40. Today they're worth almost $173 each. Qantas shares were sold for a pittance. Today they're worth many times over the price they were sold. And the most extraordinary thing that was sold in this privatisation orgy was the government gold reserves during the Howard Costello era. Remember when Peter Costello, the Federal Treasurer, the Liberal Federal Treasurer, was hailed as the world's greatest treasurer? And after 1989, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and what they believed was the triumph of capitalism, what we saw was that the share that Mr Costello sold most of Australia's gold reserve for $200 an ounce. Today, gold on the open market is around $5,000 an ounce. So this is why I say it was a fire sale. The other aspect is the ridiculous nature of the privatisation. For example, with Telecom, which is now Telstra, or telecommunications, Optus, a Singapore government-owned entity which provides, through the Optus profits, which provides for the needs of Singapore pensioners and tenants, is now owned, as I said, by the Singapore government. They have at least 1/3 of the market share, and profits that are made go to the Singapore government. Another ridiculous efforts of privatisation is the privatisation of roads. And in this country you have Transurban, one of the most profitable corporations in the world, has an almost monopoly on toll roads, charging whatever they like. And we even had the ridiculous situation of the Port of Darwin being sold to the Chinese government. So, what has this meant? Privatisation has made some members of society very rich, but it denies basic service to significant sections of the community. The privatisation of the old aged care sector has been a disaster which we can lay at the feet of the Howard government, when the private sector demanded from the Howard government the ratio of nursing staff or support staff to aged care residents be removed, so they could actually maximise their profits at the expense of elderly people who could not afford private care in the aged care sector. We saw recently how the company Qantas has maximised its profits by illegally sacking thousands of their workers and outsourcing work. We see it in terms of the profits which have been gouged out of the community through Transurban's near monopoly on toll roads in this country. There were no toll roads before the privatisation orgy. We see the cost to the individual consumer around the fact that this country's airports and naval ports have been privatised. And I could go on and on and on and on. This is one of the greatest travesties that has occurred in this nation's history, because privatisation has far-reaching implications apart from their effect on the individual in society. In a capitalist society, which theoretically is based on competition, you need a strong public sector to be able to compete with the private sector, especially in Australia, where a third tier of the economy, the collective and cooperative sector, is almost non-existent. With the privatisation of public assets, we have seen a dramatic increase in prices for basic necessities. Housing is a classical example, where the housing market is now almost totally dominated by the private sector, the public sector providing a minuscule amount of public housing to the community. And what's left of public housing is being privatised at an increasingly rapid rate. So we see this all around us. We see the cost. The cost is, one, many of these assets which were privatised were profitable. The Commonwealth Bank were profitable, the ports were profitable, the airports were profitable, Qantas was profitable. Even Medibank Private was profitable. And the profits that were made went into expanding the public services, but also any excess profits went back to the Treasury to help provide revenue for many of the basic necessities in society. So we had this situation where this highway to the Treasury was blockaded. The decrease in competition has meant that the private sector basically sets prices how it likes to insignificant number of cases, because these organisations which were privatised to increase competition have resulted in the creation of monopolies which provide ever-increasing profits for their major shareholders at the expense of the community. And last but not least is the fact that the sacrifices of generations of Australians have been pushed aside. The blood, sweat and tears, the money that went into creating these assets to provide services have been pushed, as I said before, marginalised. And the impact they had on Australian society has been written out of the history books. But the ultimate tragedy is that this privatisation orgy continues ad nauseum. It's time that we looked at incorporating, taking over, for legislation to be passed to nationalise essential services with minimal compensation to these companies that have made enough profits over the last 30 to 40 to 50 years. It's time that these corporations were nationalised and their assets were used to provide basic services. Now, people will tell you that under the Australian Constitution, if you nationalise an asset, if you take away an asset, you need to compensate people. Well, you can charge them 90% tax or 95% tax, and they will disappear overnight. And those assets will then return back to society. But this time, let's ensure that the ownership of any national assets, any state assets, which are recreated to provide the basic necessities of life, are incorporated in the Australian Constitution. Because once they are incorporated, their ownership is incorporated in the Australian Constitution, any government that wants to sell these assets would need to hold a referendum and go back to the people and ask them whether they wanted to sell these assets. And I am sure that if initially these assets had been incorporated in the Australian Constitution, referendums would be held, the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, the Commonwealth Bank, the ports, the airports, the aged care sector, the early childhood development sector, private roads, and the list goes on, would not have been sold by the Australian people, who understand how important it is in a capitalist society which is based on private profit, which is based on private gain, private profit and private gain, that everybody has the ability to access the basic necessities of life.